Before prophets spoke and commandments were carved into stone, someone was quietly pressing symbols into wet clay, counting grain, tracking labor, and trying not to forget. Tonight, as you listen, you'll drift back to that forgotten world between two rivers, where the oldest civilization on Earth unknowingly laid the foundations for stories you think you already know. Stay with me, because by the end, you may realize that the origins of biblical narratives were not born in thunder or miracles, but in silence, mud, and the slow, patient work of ordinary people trying to survive. Long before sacred texts were gathered, edited, argued over, and finally bound into what many people now call the Bible, there existed a quieter world where meaning was not yet wrapped in revelation, but stored in clay. If you move slowly back through time, past kingdoms whose names feel familiar, past prophets and kings and laws delivered from mountains, you eventually arrive at a flat and stubborn landscape between two rivers. Here, civilization did not begin with thunder or commandments. It began with mud, water, and the patient act of keeping track. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was neither gentle nor forgiving. Floods came without warning, sometimes destroying crops, sometimes failing to arrive at all. The soil, though fertile, demanded constant attention. Canals had to be dug, cleared, repaired, and watched. Fields had to be measured. Harvests had to be predicted and stored. Survival depended less on faith than on coordination. And coordination required memory. Human memory was not enough, so people began to press small marks into soft clay. At first, these marks were simple. A wedge for barley, a circle for a sheep, a line for a measure of oil. There was no story in them, no poetry. They were reminders. This many jars, that many workers. Grain owed to the temple. Grain distributed to the laborers. The people who made these marks did not know they were inventing writing. They believed they were solving a practical problem, forgetting. These early scribes lived in cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur. Their cities were dense, crowded with mud brick houses that required constant rebuilding. Nothing here lasted without effort. Even temples, which dominated the skyline, were rebuilt again and again on the same foundations, rising layer by layer as time passed. This produced the ziggurat step structures that looked permanent, but were actually the result of endless maintenance. Stability, in Sumer, was something you worked at daily. Religion existed, but it did not dominate life in the way later traditions might suggest. Gods were associated with cities, not with universal moral laws. Inanna belonged to Uruk. Enlil ruled from Nippur. Enki governed wisdom and water from Eridu. These gods were powerful, but also temperamental. They needed to be fed, honored, and managed through ritual. Their favor was practical: good harvests, stable rule, protection from disaster. Theology was less important than appeasement. Most people did not spend their days praying. They worked. Farmers rose before the heat. Laborers hauled bricks. Women brewed beer, spun wool, and managed households. Children learned trades early. Old age was not revered for wisdom alone, but for experience, knowing when the river would rise, how the soil would behave, which crops survived bad years. These details mattered more than grand ideas. The scribes sat apart from this physical labor, but they were not elite philosophers. They were clerks. Their hands cramped as they copied signs again and again. Education consisted of repetition and correction. Tablets survive that show students practicing the same word dozens of times. Mistakes scratched out, correct forms rewritten. Creativity was discouraged. Accuracy was everything. Out of this environment emerged the earliest long narratives. Not sermons, not moral instruction, but reflections on kingship, labor, loss, and death. The Epic of Gilgamesh, often mentioned in connection with the Bible, is not primarily a religious text. It is a meditation on what it means to rule, to build, and to die. Gilgamesh is introduced not as a holy man, but as a city builder, a man who constructed walls. His greatness is measured in brickwork. When the flood story appears within this epic, it is not central. It is embedded within a larger search for immortality. The flood is something that happened, something remembered, something told as a warning and a memory. The gods decide to destroy humanity not because of moral corruption, but because humans are too noisy. The reason is mundane, annoyance. This detail alone reveals a worldview, very different from later theological interpretations. Yet the structure of the story, a chosen survivor, a vessel, animals preserved. Divine regret afterward will echo through later traditions. Not because later writers copied blindly, but because stories endure when they fit existing mental frameworks. Floods were real. Survival after catastrophe mattered. Memory of disaster was useful. As centuries passed, Sumerian city-states were conquered and absorbed. Akkadian rulers adopted Sumerian writing. Babylonian kings preserved Sumerian texts. Even when the language itself was no longer spoken, it remained the language of scholarship. Sumerian became something like an academic tongue, taught in schools, revered as ancient and authoritative. This alone ensured its influence. Law codes followed a similar path. Early Sumerian laws were practical, focused on property, injury, and compensation. They assumed inequality. Punishments differed based on status. Justice was not abstract. It was negotiated. Later Babylonian codes, like that of Hammurabi, refined these principles, inscribing them publicly. When biblical law later appears, with its emphasis on covenant and obligation, it emerges from a region already saturated with legal thinking. Even the idea of divine law itself is older than the Bible. In Mesopotamia, kings claimed that laws were given by the gods to legitimize rule. The gods did not demand ethical perfection, but order. Disorder threatened survival. This emphasis on order carries forward, transformed but recognizable genealogies, so prominent in biblical texts, also reflect ancient administrative habits. Recording lineage was not about storytelling. It was about inheritance, land rights, and labor obligations. Knowing who belonged to whom mattered. These lists anchored people in time and space. They made society legible. Creation stories, too, have earlier counterparts. In Mesopotamian myths, the world emerges from chaos through division and naming. Humans are created to work, to relieve the gods of labor. This is not a fall from grace. It is a job description. When later traditions speak of humans tasked with stewardship, echoes remain. What changes over time is not the structure, but the emphasis. As cultures evolve, stories are reframed to answer new questions. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why must we obey? Older narratives are not discarded. They are reshaped. When Hebrew scribes later compile texts, they are not working in isolation. They live in a world shaped by Mesopotamian empires. Exile places them directly in Babylon, surrounded by ancient libraries and traditions. They encounter stories far older than their own oral histories. The result is not plagiarism, but conversation across centuries. This explains why parallels exist without exact matches. The biblical flood is moralized. The Mesopotamian flood is administrative. The difference reflects changing concerns. But the bones of the story remain. Even the idea of time itself shows continuity. Sumerians measured time through calendars tied to agricultural cycles. Festivals marked planting and harvest. Later religious calendars inherit this structure. Sacred time grows out of seasonal time. None of this diminishes the Bible's significance. Instead, it grounds it. It reminds you that sacred texts emerge from human contexts. They are shaped by labor, fear, memory, and survival. They do not descend fully formed. They accumulate. If you imagine the first scribe pressing a reed into clay, You are not witnessing the birth of religion. You are witnessing the birth of continuity, a way to carry information beyond one lifetime. That continuity allows stories to grow, merge, and endure. The Sumerians did not know they were laying foundations for future belief systems. They wanted their canals to work. They wanted their grain counted. They wanted their city to last one more season. But in solving those problems, they created tools that outlived them. Today, when you read ancient texts or hear stories that feel timeless, you are encountering layers. Beneath theology lies administration. Beneath prophecy lies record-keeping. Beneath revelation lies the quiet, repetitive labor of people who needed order more than meaning. History does not move in clean lines. It accumulates like sediment. Each generation builds on what lies beneath, often without realizing it. The Bible, like all enduring texts, is not an isolated miracle. It is a product of deep time, and in that deep time, before Scripture, before commandments, before prophets, there were people sitting on the floor of a mud brick room, counting barley, pressing symbols into clay, trusting that writing things down might be enough to hold the world together a little longer. As this story gently fades, there's nothing you need to remember or hold on to. The people you met tonight finished their work long ago. Their lists were counted, their tablets set aside, their days quietly ended. Their world can rest now, just as you can. This is quiet, boring sleep, a place for slow history, soft voices, and unhurried thoughts meant to carry you toward rest. If these calm journeys into the past help your mind settle, you're always welcome back here. If you'd like to support this quiet space, you can gently like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these peaceful stories reach others who are searching for something steady and simple at the end of the day. Thank you for spending this time with me. Close your eyes when you're ready and let the night take over.